If you're like me and got suckered into paying for Warhammer Plus, you've been privy to more than just infinite list building in the Warhammer 40k app. WarhammerTV is GW's very own streaming service, a place where you can catch lore dives from the people who write the stuff, painting classes, and various animated shorts and anthologies that cover a wide range of things from the grimdark future. One of these animated shows is called The Tithes, a three-part anthology exploring the themes of sacrifice and what the inhabitants of the Imperium of Man must give up, no matter how morally ambiguous it might be to do so. And if you're aware of Warhammer TV, you're also aware that the quality of what's on there varies wildly between shows. So, instead of wasting $5 a month to watch this stuff, I took one for the team and watched it for you. We're going to summarize and review all 3 episodes to determine if The Tithes is worth watching. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Starhammer. Part 1 is called Sacrifice. Picks up with our hero Sakan, a space marine of the Salamanders who was one of the main characters of the last animated show, Pariah Nexus, in his hunt for the Necron Illuminor Scissoras. Slickorag? Sazerac? We're just going to call him Sazerac. This time, Sakan is joined by Ultramarines apothecary Brutus as they try to find Sazerac and the missing bodies of some Ultramarines they believe may have been taken, but are definitely missing. Why do they care? Well, Brutus here is after the gene seed installed within each Astartes. If he can get a hold of them before the mad scientist Sazerac, he can prevent the Xenos from learning the secrets of the Astartes and keep the little organs pure so that they can continue to serve the chapter by making new Ultramarines later down the road. Our adventure starts with what's left of a Necron warrior crawling towards our 2 heroes, but it doesn't get very far. Sakan has a moment of critical thinking about how the Necrons used to be alive and wondered what they lost before becoming what they are. And Brutus basically tells them nobody cares because they're aliens and aliens suck. As the 2 Space Marines make their way through the city, the Necrons are in the process of colonizing. Brutus brings up the fact that Sakan is a weird nerd for wanting to learn about the Necrons and their lore. And Sakan tells him to defeat your enemy, you should know your enemy. Pretty sound advice, and Brutus concedes that, but says that Sakan is being too empathetic towards the alien menace. Sakan says to endure requires sacrifice, and that both the Imperium and the Necrons made sacrifices to get to where they are today. Brutus distressingly points out that Sakan is a little too human for the likes of a Space Marine, and so is the rest of his chapter. So at this point, you can see that these 2 guys are together more out of necessity than desire. And I think they do a great job in showing that with the dialogue that displays the total contrast between these 2 Marines and their chapters. You got Sakan showing a bit more humanity, which is what the Salamanders are known for, and Brutus showing the arrogance and strict adherence to the rulebook that the Ultramarines are known for. This all comes to a head when we see a pretty sick-ass fight between Brutus and a Scorpec destroyer. While Brutus comes out on top, though not without a struggle, Sakan shows up and gets a bunch of XP for not doing any of the work. Brutus, understandably, is pretty pissed off about this, and basically calls him a bitch for not helping out and running away to flank the enemy. But Sakan explains to Brutus that he's not all that different from him and has the same battle scars. They just go about things a different way, and then vaguely threatens Brutus by demanding that he doesn't question his zeal in battle ever again. Brutus contemplates this moment before apologizing, and they have a bro moment and make up. As our heroes make their way towards the Necron evil lair, we get this really neat shot of a fallen Imperial Knight. Knights are just super cool, so I thought I'd throw that in there. In the background and foreground of the scene, you can see little scarabs building Necron Legos, and things are starting to get a lot greener and Necron-y, so you know things are about to go down. They reach their destination and basically confirm that the bodies of the Ultramarines Brutus is after have been taken by Sazerac. We cut to a shot of some Necron warriors dragging the body of an Ultramarine into their spooky-ass temple thing, which then cuts back to Brutus and Sakan nerding out over what tactics they're going to use to get inside. And they get inside, of course, but not before this really cool sequence where we get to see the prowess and teamwork Space Marines are capable of. Sakan, for example, has 1 arm, so he has to toss his bolter to Brutus in the middle of a firefight to reload for him before he can get back to it. I guess he didn't have the infinite ammo cheat on like Brutus did when he was fighting the Scorpec. So they run inside, play some baseball with innocent scarab bots, and shoot some more warriors before coming face to face with a terrifying sight. The Ultramarines they've been searching for are restrained on slabs, ready to be carved up like middle school science class frogs. Brutus tells Sakan to buy him some time while he does what he has to do, and Sakan quickscopes a warrior before Sazerac decides to call him on Discord and troll him for a bit. Sazerac starts taunting Sakan to abandon Brutus and fulfill the oath of vengeance he swore in the Pariah Nexus show. and Sakan has a choice to make. Does he make good on his promise and try to stop Sazerac? Or does he stay and help Brutus? Well, the honorable Sakan chose to stay and help Brutus, and our heroes narrowly escape the lab as an awesome explosion goes off behind them, which of course they don't look at. Sakan is the first to make it out, but as Brutus comes up the ramp, Sakan immediately notices something is wrong. Brutus has taken a few shots on the way out, and is rapidly despawning. He gives his harvested organs to Sakan, who promises to bring them home, and Brutus valiantly attempts to cover Sakan's escape, but is quickly brought down by an overwhelming amount of firepower. And it's looking like Sakan might suffer the same fate, until an Ultramarines Thunderhawk picks up his radio traffic and calls in a killstreak airstrike on the Necron Temple lab thing, allowing Sakan to make good on his promise to take his cousins home. All in all, episode 1 is pretty good, lives up to its title. I'm really interested to see where they take Sakan in the future, or maybe they'll leave it up in the air. But given his oath of vengeance, I highly doubt GW will leave us wanting for everyone's favorite salamander. As with all episodes in the series, it is beautifully animated, decently written, but I think the dynamic between Sakan, Sazerac, in both Nexus and the Tithes is a bit too deep to explore in a handful of 20-minute episodes. I know that's not the theme here, but it's something that GW has to stop teasing and just let happen. Let's get into the controversial episode 2. Why is this controversial, you ask? Because it's got femstodies in it. Women in my grim dark show. Women. Harvest opens with a group of Astartes Terminators of the White Templars. Yeah, that's a point off right there. Battling against some Tyranids before cutting to a room full of Psychers who are experiencing the dreaded shadow in the warp phenomenon that Tyranids produce that plays absolute hell on anyone with psychic powers. The Adeptus Arbites show up and tell these freaked out Psychers that everything's going to be fine and they're going to be taken to safety. But the shadow in the warp is still making them tweak out. The cops aren't Psychers, so they think everyone else is just crazy. They head out, and as we all know, there's new happy endings in 40k, especially for people like Psychers. We cut to our two protagonists, a custodian named Tyreth and a sister of silence named Atlacoia. But you can't tell what Atlacoia is saying because it's in sign language. I'm not even joking. If you don't have subtitles on, you're going to miss about half the conversations in this episode. Turn them on or off for various degrees of immersion, I suppose. Anyway, we get a neat little armor up sequence for our muscle mommy as the two talk about going to retrieve a bountiful harvest, which Atlacoia is concerned might not go smoothly if she's bringing a custodian along. But Tyreth reassures her, and the two set off on their quest. What harvest could they be talking about? Well, it has to do with the black ships and the tithe of Psychers they pick up to sustain the Emperor on the Golden Throne. Thousands of these unfortunate souls are sacrificed to keep the Imperium afloat, but their deaths will be both consequential and insignificant. As our duo lands on Ystrad, Sergeant Zephan of the White Templars fills them in on their dilemma, that Tyranid scout forces have already started their shenanigans, and the guy in charge is too busy fortifying the planet to talk to a lowly custodian and Oblivion Knight. But they end up meeting with the arbitrators from earlier, who are confining the Psychers, or the Afflicted, as Atlacoia calls them. After some questioning, and Atlacoia basically telling them how fucked they are, which nobody understands because they can't see subtitles, our Sister of Silence goes to inspect the cattle for slaughter. Everything is calm for a time while they escort the harvest to the transports, until one of the Psychers goes full schizo mode and takes off sprinting, with Atlacoia not far behind. This dude lets their autism get the better of them and has an episode. But luckily, one of our hot babes is here to save the day. But suddenly, a lictor attacks. Turns out Timmy Tism over there probably attracted the lictor with all their hooting and hollering. That's alright though, they can't help it. Atlacoia does some sick ass moves, and we cut to our Judge Dredd knockoffs defending the landing zone as more Tyranids attack. And we get to what's probably the best part of the episode. Tyreth goes full guerrilla mode on some Tyranids in the most custodian way possible. And I think it's really neat that we get to watch one of these guys move and fight. The grace and discipline she moves and strikes with is everything I imagined a custodian to look like during a fight. And GW really knocked it out of the park with their depiction of custodian combat. And you gotta keep in mind, 99.99% of people in the Imperium will never see a custodian, and even fewer will see one in combat. Just try to put yourself in the shoes of one of these arbitrators and understand the sense of wonder and dread that these guys must have felt seeing a warrior of this caliber in her element. Captain Malachi, commander of the White Templar forces, shows up at the behest of Tyreth, but really all he does is throw a bunch of shade for a custodian showing up just to collect some freaks and leave them to their doom. He's understandably upset because his chapter has sworn an oath of protection to this world, and it's lasted 3,000 years. Without the proper manpower, it's going to end up being consumed by the tyrants. Tyreth then explains that, as the voice of the Emperor, he's being commanded by her to break his oath to this world, and pull his forces out to enact exterminatus upon it. Several other worlds will suffer the same fate to form a ring of lifeless planets around the sector in an attempt to divert the Hive fleets and spare any risk of Terra itself being threatened. And it looks like our captain might just refuse a direct order from the Emperor, but he swallows his pride and does what he's told. As this episode draws to a close, we see reality set in for our Psykers. As they weep and wail aboard a black ship, the horror sets in that they're not going to safety, but to suffer a fate much worse than what the Tyranids had in store for them. The second episode obviously still clings to the ideas of what's required to be sacrificed so that the Imperium endures, but we really only see it at the very end with Captain Malachite, and for a whole 2 seconds more or less. Tyrith and Atlatoya don't really have to struggle with this concept at all, and maybe that's part of the point. These two are so high up in the Imperial hierarchy that they're not the ones sacrificing anything. While the action is pretty great, the general theme of tithing isn't relevant here, aside from the literal tithe of Psykers in the episode that it should focus on. But honestly, I think it struggles to find its footing here. It's certainly the weakest point in the anthology so far. Episode 3 is quite different, and in my perfect opinion, is the best one. This time around, we're tagging along with a unit of Khazarkin and a Commissar as they run a mission to collect a tithe of ammo from an already struggling Imperial world. They drop in from orbit aboard a Valkyrie and are flanked by a couple of fighters from the Aeronautica Imperialis. The banter between the squad and the ships is pretty spot on with what you'd expect from a group of battle-hardened spec ops running a delivery mission for the Administratum. The Commissar is sort of brooding and emo, but he's got his reasons that we'll get to in a second. But, as I'm sure you've come to expect, things don't remain calm for long. Orc scrap jets scream through the clouds and begin a ferocious dogfight with the Imperial pilots attempting to protect the dropships. This is a really fucking sick Top Gun sequence that ends when one of our brave pilots rams his jet into the orcs to save everyone else, giving us our first taste of sacrifice in this episode. As the group lands, a relieved Imperial Guard commander comes to greet them, ecstatic that they're being brought enough ammo to take the fight to the Xenos. But to his dismay, it's quite the opposite. Instead, he's to load all remaining ammunition onto the ships, as Minatorium has determined that this is the appropriate tithe to keep the greater Imperial war machine running. The commander here is furious with this order, initially not accepting it, and a Western-style standoff ensues between the Khazarkin and the planet's defenders. Ultimately, the commander falls back on his faith that the Emperor protects, and orders his team to stand down and relinquish their ammunition. We then turn to Sergeant Paya and Commissar Brock, discussing their differing views of the situation, and we get a look into the inner mind of a nepotism baby Commissar. He goes on to explain how he's killed 50 soldiers, not Xenos or heretics, but 50 Imperial soldiers who were scared, angry, and lost, and that could have been anything else. They weren't criminals or anything like that, they were just people. Brock gives his last mag to Sergeant Pia, saying he would rather die alongside these guardsmen than standing behind and over their shoulder. Perhaps commissars can be people after all. Suddenly, orcs start blowing shit up and they hop through the breach. This is exactly how I imagine orcs to be on the tabletop. Massive, brutish, stronger than anything. You see that in how they effortlessly crush guardsmen, and the teamwork it can sometimes take for normal humans to bring one of these hulking monstrosities down. We also get to see the Khazarkin team in action, flawlessly and silently following commands, executing shots in perfect harmony with one another as they fight to defend the tithe. Commissar Brock is also in the fighting, going absolutely ham on some orcs with his chainsword. And while he puts up a good fight, he eventually gets his shit rocked by this power claw orc, who just popped a guardsman's head like a pimple a few seconds earlier. As he lays on his back in the dust, coughing up his own blood, it looks like it's the end, until Sergeant Pia saves the day with a perfectly timed headshot. As our heroes emerge victorious, they know a large orc host can show up at any second. Brock urges them to get out of there, saying that a squadron will be sent to cover them as they bring the tithe into orbit. A disgruntled soldier asks why they couldn't get that on the way down, only for Brock to reply that there wasn't any cargo then, and therefore, nothing to protect. As the guardsmen prepare to make their final stand with only their knives, cut to the tithe, finally making it to where it needs to go. Yeah, you see all those towering structures? Those aren't skyscrapers. Those are stacks of tithe. This is like the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, but times a million. Anyhow, we get to the ground, and after a brief exchange with Sergeant Pia, the Minatorium representative disapproves of the tithe, orders it to be destroyed, because the tectonic platforms keeping everything up can't bear any further weight. The Minatorium brushes this off like it's nothing, as Pia looks on in horror. She realizes all those who died for nothing. Now that was a hell of an episode. I don't think I need to go into too much detail here about how this installment is the very personification of the Tithes. This is what it means to sacrifice for the greater good. This is what it looks and feels like to desperately give your all in hopes of a brighter tomorrow. This is what it feels like when everything you've strived for turns to dust. So, now that we've reviewed it all, is Warhammer 40k The Tithes worth watching? Absolutely. This beautifully animated, well-written, action-packed anthology shows just how demanding the Tithes of the Imperium are on those who inhabit it. Episode 2 is the weakest link, however. Its focus on Tyreth and the action is cool, but it doesn't capture the overall theme of sacrifice that, ultimately, the Psyker Harvest will be the only ones dealing with. We see that the sacrifices made to ensure a fighting chance for the Imperium affect everyone. From the mighty Space Marines to the lowest guardsmen, everyone has to give up something to keep the engine of war trucking through the fight. Is the show worth watching? For sure. Is it worth getting Warhammer Plus for? Probably not. Unless you play a lot of tabletop and have multiple different armies, I really don't recommend paying for it. But if you're like me and you want to fork out a few bucks for convenience, it's okay, I guess. Hell of a lot better than the last app they used for list building, that's for sure. Did you watch the Tithes? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below about the Tithes, Warhammer Plus, and how I did on the summaries and the review. As always, drop a like if you like it, a subscribe if you really liked it, and check out the community tab for shitposts and shenanigans. Link down below for the social and other goodies. I'll see you in the next one. Toodles.